You asked about the 2026 election and what's going to happen with the 2026 election. And you also asked in that context about Steve Bannon's statement today that Donald Trump would run again in 2028 and they had a plan for that. Now, let's step back just a little bit on that and start from the premise again. And one of the things I was thinking about talking today, and I was thinking one of the things that's always worth thinking about is if you were going to do something, how would you do it? Because that shows you how much of stuff that you're afraid of maybe doesn't come to pass. So, um, like literally, one of the things that I would used to say to my students, if you got to start a movement, how are you going to do it? Like literally, how are you going to do it? Well, you're going to find a friend or two, and you're going to start talking. But pretty soon, for example, you need to be able to identify other people who think like you do. So, what are you going to do? Maybe clothes, maybe a flag. But if it's going to be a flag, it's going to be a really simple flag because you got to be able to just do it really quickly. If it's a popular flag, you just work through how you would literally do something. So in the case of Trump running again, literally, how would you do that? There is a constitutional amendment saying he can't. However, we already have a blueprint that he tried in 2020, which was that they would simply refuse to recognize the legitimate election of a Democrat. And that I think we can absolutely see coming, not least because of the fact that the administration is putting election deniers into important places. They're trying to get rid of voting rights in a number of states. They're trying to gerrymander the states in such a way that the Republicans get a huge leg up. The Supreme Court is certainly considering throwing out the Voting Rights Act, which will give the Republicans another 19 seats, up to 19 seats in the House of Representatives. You can see the steel already going into place. That's a real problem that I'll talk about more and write about more in the future because I want to get something in before that today. But now let's think about really what that looks like in 2020. In 2028 about Trump running again. What does that really look like? Do you really think they're going to be able to prop him up and be even vaguely coherent in 3 more years? I don't. I don't know if you watched his press conference today, but it was bonkers. I mean, the man is not okay. And so if you're worried about 2028, once again, I think that, and Trump, that's probably borrowing trouble in the case of Trump. But the problem in the terms of the skewing of our system so that whichever Democrat, I'm sorry, I keep doing that because I'm going to want to talk about the Democrats, whichever Republican wins is automatically going to win. That's really concerning. And that's what a number of people, including me, are very, very worried about. Now, again, we're hearing a lot about the 2026 election. That was 2028. Now, the 2026 election, and somebody wrote to me, didn't put it on there, but wrote to me and asked a great question about what the Democrats should do in terms of their ideology going into 2026, this one coming up. And this is very dear to my heart because I'm seeing a lot of discussion within the Democratic Party and to the left of it about whether the Democrats should go centrist or whether they should go progressive. And I have a really hard time with this argument, not least because I'm not paying a lot of attention to the structure of the Democratic Party right now. But because what does that look like? What does that mean in today's America to go centrist? And I think and I could be wrong, but I think what people mean is to be more like the Republicans, to try and pick up Republican voters by kind of wiggling over toward the Republicans. And what I would say to that is that the Republican Party currently has veered so far to the right, it's off the cliff. And to be a centrist American right now is to embrace the policies that are being talked about as if they're progressive, as if they are somehow on the left, and they're really not. The idea of taxing people more progressively than they currently are, so that the wealthier people pay more in taxes, So our world looks much more like it did under George W. Bush, for example, hardly a left-wing reactionary, or under, in the 1990s when we'd last had a budget surplus under Clinton, looking like that is extraordinarily popular. So I would call that centrist. Higher taxes on the wealthy is a really popular position. What about things like healthcare? Do we go? What does centrist mean in a world in which the Republicans are trying to get to cut Medicaid dramatically and throw millions of people off their healthcare? To me, centrist says people should have health care. And by the way, the person who first suggested that in the United States is Theodore expletive Roosevelt more than 120 years ago. He was a Republican president at the beginning of the 20th century. That to me does not say progressive in a derogatory sense. That says centrist. So when people say, what should the Democrats do? What I look at in this moment is the 1850s, because in that moment we had something that looks very similar, I think, to where we are today. That is, the Democrats in that period, the parties have switched sides. The Democrats in that period had fallen under the control of a very small group of elite enslavers who were really, really, really wealthy and really controlled the American economy. And they basically said, hey, it's our country. We get to run it however we want. We're going to spread human enslavement into the American West. We're going to take over the North through the House of Representatives. And we're going to start, and you can read this, by the way, it's in things like the Cornerstone speech by Alexander Stephens. We're going to run the world because we have all the money and we're going to enslave people all over the world. That's not the way they put it, but that's, this is the great future they kept talking about. And when that happened, people in the North who recognized that they were going to lose access to the American West and lose democracy in the American North said, no, you're not going to do that. Even though we have been voting Democratic or voting Whig, which were the opponents of the Democrats, we're pissed off that the Whigs are not taking a stronger stand, and we're sure not going to cooperate with the Democrats. And they came together as what were known as the anti-Nebraska parties. I'm not going to go into the Kansas-Nebraska Act right now, but they went into these anti-Nebraska parties. And for 2 years, they didn't really have any idea yet except what they weren't. It's going to be Abraham Lincoln who decides to articulate what they are for. But when that happened, the people who stood up and said, we believe in equality before the law, we believe in the idea of equal access to resources, we believe in the idea that we have a say in our government, and we are opposed to oligarchy, those people won. They won across the board, even in the states that were dominated by the Democrats, who were thoroughly racist at the time. This idea that somehow the Democrats, the Northerners, were all in favor of Black rights in 1860s, just in the 1850s, is just completely wrong. And similarly in Massachusetts, for example, the laws that they were passing there were fervently anti-Irish. So the idea that people were in favor of equal rights is just wrong. What they were in favor of was the idea that they were not going to lose their democracy to an oligarchy. But crucially, there was huge push from the American people for people to stand up and to fight for those principles. Now, what does that look like in 2025? To me, it looks like fighting back against the things that we're seeing out of the White House right now. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, and to fight for the things that we care about: education, healthcare, equal access to resources, equal treatment before the law, no more special interests running our government. All those things that have really, really wide support among the country. So this division between, first of all, I don't know what centrist means in a world where all the positions that are identified in many media sources are actually, as progressive, are actually shared by more than 70% of Americans. That sounds pretty centrist to me. But I think what they mean is cozying up to the positions that Republicans have taken in the hopes that somehow that will peel away Republican voters. And I'm just not sure that's the case. I think that Republican voters are upset by corruption and by the takeover of our system by the wealthy and by the lack of health care and by the lack of education and so on, as Democratic voters are. They just need to have people stand up and articulate that. Now, again, you asked the question. That's where I am on that issue. And let me just go a little further than you asked about. And that's that. What does that mean? Does it mean we shut up the candidates who are farther to the left and we move to the candidates that are farther to the right? I maintain that we need all of the voices, especially right now, but we need all of those voices participating in our government right now, because they're waking people up to issues they didn't even know they cared about, and they're making people understand that those issues could be addressed at the state or the national level or the local level. And so I'm not a big believer in silencing new voices, especially voices you don't like. I think those are very, very welcome. It's important, though, to remember that in order to get things through a state house or through Congress, you need to know what you're doing. You need to be able to make compromises. You need to understand the different areas of the country. You need to understand what it is possible to get through. And you have to be willing to work to build the structures that will enable you to do that. So, as you know, if you listen to me, I care very deeply about American taxation and how it has been really perverted, I think, over the last 40 years. And, if I could wave a magic wand, that's what I would do first. I would fix American taxation. Well, you know what? I can't wave a magic wand. In order to get something like that through the Congress, you've got to change who's in the Congress. And in order to change who's in the Congress, you have to change who's in the state houses. Because in order to get it through Congress, you've got to get rid of partisan gerrymandering. And you've got to get rid of a Supreme Court that is going to support that kind of partisan gerrymandering. And that kind of slow building work over a generation is not something that is in my wheelhouse. And it's not something I think the Democrats have been very good at. So one of the things that it's important to remember in the next couple of years is, yes, we want all those voices, but we need those voices to recognize what it takes to build a governmental movement, because throwing bombs just doesn't do anything. You need to be able to get in there and work with people. If they continue to get away with declaring major cities war zones, will it stop the voting process? Okay, so I'm going to back up a little bit here. I just threw out Stephen Miller's name. I also threw out Kristi Noem's name. And I think there's something that so far I haven't seen in the questions that is important. And maybe it's because you're seeing it everywhere else and you don't need me to talk about it. But there's two really important things that go hand in hand, maybe three, that are all operating right now. First of all, Donald Trump is not apparently, I'm sorry, I just hit delete again. Donald Trump is apparently not in control of the administration. He's pretty openly not able to answer anything that's going on. He throws questions to other people. If you hear him in interviews, he just sounds bonkers. He's not calling the shots. Two people at least are the ones running things. One is, or appear to be, one is Russell Vought at the Office of Management and Budget, and I'm not going to talk more about him today, I don't think. But the other is Stephen Miller, who is the White House Deputy Chief of Staff. White House advisor Miller is, according to The Guardian, the one who has ordered the strikes on the Venezuelan boats. A report out today says that he thinks this is a way to convince people that immigrants are terribly dangerous. At a time when, as I mentioned before, the Trump administration is deeply underwater on its attacks on immigrants, especially undocumented immigrants, because during the campaign, Trump said that he was only going to go after, the criminals, the rapists, the murderers. But what people didn't understand, and when I had an argument with somebody who was voting MAGA over this, what people didn't understand is the Trump administration considered anybody who had entered the country illegally a dangerous criminal because they had broken the law about not coming in without documentation. Now, that is not a felony, by the way, but they considered anybody who was undocumented a criminal. And that's what they did in the first term. And that's what they meant in the second term. But you had to read between the lines. Now you're seeing it played out, and people don't like it. They do not like losing their neighbor of 30 years. They do not like, watching mothers being torn away from their children. They do not like this. So you still see Trump and Kristi Noem and people like Miller talking about how immigrants are, criminals and terrible and so on, and yet support for immigration now because of these attacks is the highest it's been in years and years and years. People are like, wait a minute, we're a country of immigrants. And a little bit of a rabbit hole here. I just want to, well, never mind. Although that's killing me. I might come back to it. So he's apparently trying to convince people that these people in these boats are bringing in, as Trump said, enough drugs to kill. I think Trump said 30,000 people. Well, there's a real issue here in that the drugs that tend to kill people in the United States, the illicit drugs, because some of these drugs can be used in therapeutic ways as well, but the illicit drugs tend to be fentanyl, which comes from Mexico, from precursor chemicals that are made in China. And that's what the Biden administration worked to do, was to break that cycle so that China would crack down on the shipping of precursor chemicals. And the administration, that both the Mexican and the American administrations, were cracking down on the financing of what are essentially at this point factories building fentanyl in Mexico. But the people that the U.S. has been targeting have been from Venezuela, which does produce, I think it's cocaine. I'm sorry, I'm not really good on I'm better on where the interventions are than where the actual drugs are grown. But in any case, they do produce drugs, but it's not fentanyl. They produce something else. And at least one alleged wife of one of the people who died, said, my husband was a fisherman. And of course, they're being struck way farther than they ever could have gotten across the water to the U.S. in those small boats. So it doesn't add up. I mean, the administration has never said has never shown any evidence to lawmakers or to the public that they're actually hitting drug dealers. They're just showing these videos of these boats blowing up, and they are truly horrific videos. I would urge you not to watch things with all the trauma that we're already going through, not to watch the things that really you think will be a problem for you. I do try and watch them because I feel like I'm keeping a record and I need to see things, but they are profoundly disturbing. So if Miller's in charge of that, Miller also wants to get rid not only of undocumented immigrants, he wants to get rid of people of color altogether. And, he has this fantasy of this sweep of stopping immigrants, of turning America into some fantasy version of his past. We have always been a country of immigrants. And the country, by the way, dates from the Constitution. Although we certainly have a precursor to that. But we've always been a nation of immigrants. His family is a nation of immigrants. I mean, his family is a family of immigrants. And when people talk about it, it always gets me when somebody like Bill O'Reilly or Sean Hannity talks about this great past before those people arrived. Because in the 19th century, Irish Americans were literally not considered white, nor were Italian Americans. And so this idea of there was some pure white, I mean, whiteness really is a construct. I'm not going to go through that, but this idea that anyway, all right, that was the rabbit hole I wasn't going to get down. Anyway, Miller is really going after the purification of the country, in his words or in his ideology, into a white Christian nation, which it never has been, by the way. It just never has been. We had Muslims in one of the first non-indigenous people to set foot on what became the United States of America was a Black Muslim man named Estevanico, which someday I'll do a video on. But anyway, I'll stop. But He has this fantasy of going back to what he thinks of this white world. But the problem with that is it involves getting rid of the Democrats who are protecting the idea of a multicultural democracy. So one of the things he is doing is he is trying to declare war on democratic cities, on cities where people of color vote, where women vote. And in order to do that, they've tried a number of different things. And one of the things that Stephen Miller is really pushing is the idea of Donald Trump invoking the Insurrection Act. The Insurrection Act is under Title 10 of the U.S. Code. The U.S. Code is our laws. They're available online if you ever want to look. They're pretty complicated, but they're not, they're divided up, so you can find this stuff pretty easily. And the Insurrection Act gives the president power to override the Posse Comitatus Act, which is from 1878, and says that the government cannot use federal troops against U.S. citizens to enforce, normal law enforcement. You can override that with the Insurrection Act, which is actually sort of a boiled down series of laws from a long period of time. Miller desperately wants Trump to invoke the Insurrection Act because, as he says, that gives Trump any power he wants. It gives him plenary power. I'm sure there's a question here about that. What this is all about is that there is a German political theorist named Carl Schmitt. I've talked about him before, named Carl Schmitt, and he looked at liberal democracies and he wasn't keen on how liberal democracies worked. And he said that liberal democracies, and this reflects the constitution under which the Weimar Republic worked, but he said, if you have an escape clause, essentially, that says you have, you can create an exception, that's where the power in that constitution really resides. It's extra constitutional. You can go outside it. And I've talked a lot about how this administration is going outside the Constitution because you can declare an emergency and then do whatever you want. And if you can do that, you can make everything an emergency and you can get rid of liberal democracy. Well, Trump has announced, I believe it's 8 emergencies, declared 8 emergencies since he took power, a tariff emergency, an emergency at the border, and so on, to garner all this power. But if he invokes the Insurrection Act, according to Miller, he can do anything he wants. That's the plenary power. But somebody asked the other day, asked here, why did Miller do that the other day when he was talking to CNN and he said, well, as we know, under Title 10, if Trump invokes that, he has plenary power. And then Miller just stopped. But it wasn't a technical difficulty. Miller's eyes were still moving. It didn't go dead. Why did he just stop there? Well, maybe he had a brain freeze, which, by the way, I did once on a radio show. I completely forgot everything. I couldn't remember anything. My mind went completely black. And I'm just looking around my kitchen like, what am I doing here? So it can happen. It's only happened once, but like literally, I still am sitting there thinking, I'm on a radio show and I have no idea what to say next. There was a book tour probably 20 years ago. So maybe he just had a brain freeze. Or maybe he was playing to the one person who is his main audience. He is constantly on TV. Trump watches him, and he is feeding Trump these stories about how terrible the country is and how much power Trump has. And leaving that last word, plenary power, and then stopping, that's what everybody heard. That's what Trump heard. And that is clearly very much on Miller's mind. He desperately wants Trump to invoke the Insurrection Act, and that would give him the power to use the troops against the people that the administration is calling traitors, is calling un-American, is saying, they are now saying that anybody who speaks up against Trump is Antifa, which isn't even a thing. It's the idea that you don't want fascism. I guess I'm Antifa, right? And they're running this whole idea that there's this organized group of people who are somehow a conspiracy theory, which is just bonkers. I'm sorry, just bonkers. So That idea of getting Trump to agree to invoke the Insurrection Act is part of what's going on with these. They are clearly showing him videos of Portland in 2020 when he talks about boarded up plywood windows, for example. That was actually the case on the main square of Portland in certain places in 2020. It's not at all the case today. I mean, before the judge who just took on a case about the deployment of National Guard troops in Portland said, there were 20 people at the ice facility, and they were giving you the middle finger. That is not an insurrection. That's protest. There's just no reason to call out any kind of troops. So that whole concept of creating an insurrection and saying you can put troops on the streets because of that is, to go back to that question, very much about 2026. It is very clear to everybody that this administration is profoundly unpopular, and that when it goes, not if it goes, when it goes, we're going to look at an entirely new country. And so those people who are wedded to the idea of their ideology of Christian nationalism or of white nationalism in Miller's case, or even just of power, even just people who want to be making bank on this administration, as a number of them are doing everything they can to hold on to that power. And this is part of the whole attempt to keep the idea of there being an insurrection going on in Chicago or Portland. Why those cities? Somebody asked here, because Portland, I think they thought might be easy after 2020 to get people to turn out and create a situation that might look as if it were an insurrection. LA, similarly. Chicago, because it would be a real prize for Trump, because J.B. Pritzker is there, and because he resents J.B. Pritzker so profoundly.
7 months now of being here on Substack. I've just loved every minute of it and talking to so many great people like Heather Cox Richardson. And there she is right there. Heather, how are you? Great to see you again.
It's good to see you. How are you doing down there? Aren't you in Washington?
I'm in DC. I took my little dog Duke over to the protest last night that was here in DC, and people are starting to get fired up about this stuff.
Good, good. Well,
Yeah.
summer is never, or often not a great time for people to push back against the administration, but September and October tend to be biggies. Unfortunately, they also tend to be the months when people look at the economy and realize we're in trouble. So I'm a little nervous about that, but
Yeah.
we've got no choice but to move forward, right?
No, there's no question. I'm worried about it too, because everybody's been sort of riding high and thinking and sort of whistling past the graveyard a little bit and thinking, well, Trump, he's dangerous to democracy, but as long as we're still making a buck, everything's okay. And I just, there's just always a bill to pay, and I sort of feel like that's coming.
I can't agree more,
Yeah.
and that's one of the things that's so incredibly frustrating. I actually wrote a whole letter this morning about the pieces of our government that have been dismantled that people aren't paying any kind of attention to yet. I mean, silly things like the idea that there aren't really people inspecting the ports and the internet for people to be importing things like ants into this country, which is a
Right.
story Wired did a couple of days. And, most people
Interesting.
aren't walking around thinking about the invasion of exotic species, but that's how we lost a lot of the orange crop. That's how we've lost,
Mm,
a lot of New England to things like bittersweet, or, all the things that happen when you import exotics. And that bill is going to come due on somebody else's watch.
yeah. There's no question. And speaking of bills coming due, I mean, I don't know where to start. I pinged you earlier today because of the John Bolton news, and then this Ghislaine Maxwell transcript news came down. And obviously, I mean, this is pretty, in your face in terms of they're just trying to bury this on a Friday evening. The fact that she didn't say anything troublesome about Donald Trump. I mean, no kidding. That's why she was moved over
That's right.
to a minimum security facility. But, they're trying awfully hard. They're trying so darn hard to put this thing to rest, and they're just not doing it.
Yeah, that's because you know it's on fire. You just know it's
Yeah.
on fire. I mean, that's one thing that's been really interesting about Trump is because He says, he blurts out what is uppermost in his mind all the time. And I
Yes.
feel like I've spent the last at least 6 years looking at the space around the elephant to try and figure out what the elephant is. And one of the stories that is not getting covered today with the raid on John Bolton's house and office and with the many other things that are going on in Washington, D.C., is the fact that the administration has just fired the Pentagon's director of intelligence.
Mm,
And Tulsi Gabbard, for the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, has just said
right.
she's reducing intelligence officers by 40%.
Unbelievable.
And well, but like, what's going on with that? Like,
I
why
agree with you. I
why
agree
is
with you.
Trump so cozy with Putin all the time? Why, when we started talking about Epstein, did he suddenly start talking about Russia? I mean, I
Yes.
don't know the answers to those things, but it's kind of like you're trying to watch this. It's like trying to watch an impressionistic painting and think, wait a minute, what are these dots adding up to? And I don't see yet what they're adding up to, but I don't think the story is just that he is attacking people he doesn't like. That's part of the story, but
Yes.
I don't think it's the whole story. What do you think?
Well, that's very interesting that you say that. I mean, sometimes it's complicated with Trump, sometimes it's simple, and it's hard to know which is what we're dealing with. I do wonder whether it's as simple as John Bolton has been all over TV the last couple of weeks, trashing Trump after that ridiculous summit with Vladimir Putin, if you want to call it that, up in Anchorage, which was a total, I mean, just an embarrassment to the country. And it doesn't sound like they have much new information on John Bolton to warrant. I don't know what judge was hearing this and authorized this warrant to go and raid John Bolton's house. But Trump has had this grudge against John Bolton going back to when I covered Donald Trump the first time he was president. I mean, John Bolton wrote that book. It was an incendiary book. He was very tough on Donald Trump, and they tried to stop that book from being written. I mean, I remember covering that, and it's been this way ever since. And I just wonder if it was a moment where he just thought, okay, time for a new distraction. He's been all over TV. Let's go get him. But you might be right. It may have something. I mean, Trump today was just holding up that picture with Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, which was weird.
It was so
I'm sorry, it
weird.
was just weird.
Yeah,
Like, that was supposed to be a meeting about FIFA, and all of a sudden, he's holding up a picture and talking about how sad he is that Putin can't be at FIFA. I mean, that
yeah,
why is that uppermost in his mind?
yeah. I don't know. And I've called it the Scooby Doo mystery because at some point we're going to find out that the mask is going to come off of Old Man Withers at the haunted amusement park, and we're going to find out what this is. But we just don't know what it is with Trump and Vladimir Putin. Is it a financial thing? Is it compromise, as we all thought it might have been back in 2017? Trump has over and over again called it the hoax and the hoax, and that makes me think that maybe there is some fire, not just smoke, when it comes to some of that. I really don't know. But I do find raiding John Bolton's house to be a very worrisome development. And talking about Vladimir Putin, it reminds me of what goes on in Putin's Russia.
Well, that's just it. I'm less
Yeah.
concerned about what happened in the past than
Yeah.
why he is so obsessed with it going forward. And it seems to me that what we are looking at is not just retribution against enemies, although, Trump has said he was going to do that, so much as an attempt to rig the elections going forward so that he or people like him stay in power. Because if you think about what Russian operatives actually did in 2016, aside from, all the stories that people heard, is we know that they flooded social media. We know that they worked to weaken ideas about American democracy, to pit the ends of the spectrum against the middle, so that they could insert somebody like Donald Trump. And we seem to be getting rid of all the guardrails that could stop that from happening again, the guardrails that people put in place after 2016 and then during the Biden administration. And so when I look at the attempt to intimidate opponents like Bolton, but also like Senator Adam Schiff of California, or
Yeah.
Letitia James, the Attorney General of New York,
Right.
or the governor of the Federal Reserve governor that they went after this week. That's certainly part of shut up and do what I say, but It does seem to me to be an attempt to guarantee that the not just that, but the attempt to put troops in major democratic cities, which are the center of democratic power, to really demonstrate that the administration holds control over Washington D.C. There are many aspects of this that look like it's really about destroying our ability to choose our leaders.
Yes, and I wonder, Heather, what's on your mind in terms of that? Because that to me is, you and I can say what we want to say and be outspoken and so on. It worries people, it terrifies people when National Guard troops start showing up in communities. And it was just said today over at the Pentagon that these National Guard troops are going to be authorized to carry their service issued weapons. Um, that it's you and I can say all we want, but when there's a gun in our face, that it's a different story, and that worries me.
And it should worry you.
Yeah.
I will just point out that it appears that the National Guard troops overwhelmingly don't want to be given these assignments. They have
Yes.
lives. This is why they signed up for the National Guard, not to be deployed in Washington D.C. or other cities to, theoretically police, but mostly they're standing around the mall and the places where the tourists are.
Yeah.
And we can tell that. That's not just me talking. We can tell that because of the re-up rate after the National Guard was federalized in Los Angeles. And normally, about 60% of people whose terms of service come up reenlist. And after that deployment, only about 21% did. They wanted no part of it. So that's
Yeah.
an important thing to remember here is this is not yet a military that answers to Donald Trump. It has been a professional military. These are very well trained people who volunteered for one reason or another. Trump is trying to make them his, but so far that hasn't happened.
Yeah. There's no question about it. And I was down in the mall yesterday trying to get a look at all of this, and they're walking around the mall. I saw 2 dozen of them in front of the National African American History Museum, and I was, I think, mentioning it to maybe to April Ryan or somebody earlier this week. How would that make you feel if you're seeing National Guard troops in Mississippi in front of the National African American History Museum? My God. And I just, it makes me wonder, what have we done to allow this to happen in our country, where this is tolerable, this is allowed to happen, and there's no way a red state governor would tolerate this coming from a Democrat with Democrat National Guard, National Guard troops from Democratic states.
No, that's right.
Yeah, yeah,
And it is worth remembering that political scientists will tell you that even one single encounter with a police officer makes somebody less likely to vote. So
yeah,
the idea that we're seating at this point, how many soldiers is it in Washington D.C.? I think it's 4,000 right now, and soon to
yeah.
go up. Is that
It's
right?
at I think it's about 2,000
Or 2,000 going
so
up.
far, but that was
Right.
that was as of yesterday. So and now it's up to 6 states. So I think you may be right in that it is growing to that level. And when I was talking with Mike Fanone earlier on in the last hour, he is saying he's hearing from his police sources that this is just the beginning. That Trump has no plans of pulling them out after 30 days. And that the reason why you have multiple states involved is that there may be something of a rotation, and that these rotations are going to continue.
What does he say about how the people he talks to feel about it?
He said that there's a great deal of worry inside the NPD right now, inside the law enforcement community in Washington, D.C., because they don't want to be asked to do illegal things,
No.
and they don't want to be a part of this. I mean, cops. Yeah, there are problems with law enforcement in this country, but what cops want to be part of a police state? I mean that to me is the un-American part of all of this, is that Trump is trying to turn this country into a police state, and Heather, it's counter to who we are. It's not who we are.
Well, so you asked how we got here, and I think
Yeah.
it's important to realize that the Republican Party has gone in the 1980s from a time of really objecting to the idea of the New Deal and the policies that the Democrats were advancing to starting to believe that any kind of democratic governance was illegitimate. And we could talk about how that happened, but that had turned into, because democratic governance is illegitimate, we need to weight the scales of the country in order to make sure that Democrats don't win office. And so you get at Citizens United and the gutting of the Voting Rights Act and the gerrymandering of states, the severe gerrymandering that happens after Barack Obama is elected in 2008. But now we have gotten to the point, I think, where the Republican Party, the MAGAs, because these are not traditional Republicans, are
Yeah.
willing to give up on democracy altogether and say anybody who wants to use the federal government for the good of the American people is a socialist, is a communist, is, fill in the blank, and therefore they must never be allowed to rule. And that is exactly what happened in the United States after the Civil War during Reconstruction, when then it
Mm.
was the Democrats, they've switched places. The Democrats ultimately said, listen, we don't care if you can win office freely and fairly. We don't believe you have the right ever to hold office because we don't agree with your ideas. And we're seeing that happen at a national level now. And I will say one of the things that jumps out to me is for years, people have said to me, and I'm primarily a scholar of Reconstruction, and people have said to me,
Mm.
why didn't people fight back? And my answer was always exactly what you identified. Terrorism works by showing a gun to a few people and making sure a lot of people hear about it, but also because people who should have been paying attention didn't think that was what was really going on. Because, oh, this is about crime. Oh, this is only about this election. Oh, this is only about, and they didn't pay attention to the bigger picture. And I
Mm.
really hope the fact we have social media and that we're having such fast responses to the overreach of the Trump administration will wake people up to the fact it is now or never if we want to preserve American democracy.
Well, and Trump is saying the quiet part out loud, or as I sometimes say, the riot part out loud. When he put out on Truth Social, this is just in the last 24 hours, that, hey, big win for the great state of Texas. And he goes, I don't want to read the whole thing because it's so nauseating, but he essentially says he wants other states like Florida and Indiana and others to jump in and redraw their congressional maps. And he says, on top of that, if we stop mail in voting, which is, of course, something he's done before, if we do these two things, he says, quote, we will pick up 100 more seats and the crooked game of politics is over. What he's saying there is basically that democracy is over.
That's right.
And it's delusional for him to think that he could pick up 100 seats without outright cheating. And I mean, this is should we call this the big rig? I mean, this is Trump. He's trying to rig the next midterm cycle,
Oh, I like that. I like the big rig.
the
But
big
you
rig.
also you just had an important word there, and that was delusional. The thing in this that is the real wild card to me is that Trump is cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. He is not
Yes.
40-year-old man who knows what he's doing. It is my impression that the people in the White House around him are deliberately putting in front of him sort of real estate things for him to do, add a new wing to the White House, gold everywhere,
Mm.
walking around on the top of the White House. Today at that press conference, he was talking about um, um, redoing the Kennedy Center that he was calling the Trump Kennedy Center. I think they're trying to keep him busy while they grab all the centers of power so that when he can no longer be propped up behind the Resolute desk. Have you noticed that he actually sits now behind the Resolute desk as if he's holding the rest of the world at bay and
Yes.
doesn't is not able to engage in conversation? When that happens, the game will already be in play to put somebody else in there. And one of the things that I hope those who are huge fans of Donald Trump recognize is once you have given him this system, it's there for JD Vance, it's there for anybody else they choose to put in there. And those are not the people that American voters have ever expressed any great support for. JD Vance has never had a base.
That's exactly right. And to his mental state, I mean, I used to tell people during the first term that he was crazy like a fox, but I think this time around it's more like crazier than a shithouse rat. And I think that he is not fully in control of what he is doing. And I think you're right on. And they did some of this to some extent during the first term where they tried to distract him, give him things to do. And now it's on steroids because my sense of it is because I witnessed some of this the first time around is that there are probably people on the inside who may be just as MAGA as he is, but are probably terrified of how bananas he has gotten. And when he's showing up, what was it, earlier this morning, and he had the hat on that said Trump was right about everything. It's the president of the United States. He
Yes,
looks
and
like he's
remember,
lost it.
well, totally. And remember, we're seeing him in his best. We're seeing him when they
Right.
have cleaned him up for the cameras, when they have adjusted his meds in whatever way needs to be done. Behind the scenes, it's not pretty, and
Yeah.
that Stephen Miller, the Deputy White House Chief of Staff, and that Russell Vogt from the Office of Management and Budget are really the ones that are running the immigration issues and the cuts to the U.S. government. Those are enormously unpopular, and they also know they've got to grab as much power as they can while he is still upright.
Yeah.
But I hope this is something that I sort of have given up on the Republican senators ever recognizing that they're essentially just throwing away their own power. But I do hope they recognize that once this power goes into the hands of a mad king, it's also there for the next guy who may not be so mad, but now has that power.
Right. And somebody like a JD Vance or Marco Rubio, who appears to be so Machiavellian that I mean, he was very much an establishment Republican. I mean, he did come up with the Tea Party movement, was very much an establishment Republican, was running as one back in 2016. Remember when he and Trump used to get into it, and Marco Rubio said that Trump was a con man. And you're absolutely right. And the willingness to sell one's soul, for it's extraordinary to me. And to go back to what you're saying about Tulsi Gabbard trying to clear out 40% of the people at the Director of National Intelligence. These are the people, Heather, you and I both know this all too well. This office was created to prevent another 9/11.
Yeah, yeah.
It was
No,
yes.
no, because we're probably driving people over the edge, it is worth pointing out that it's worth remembering Trump is bonkers, and that these moves are deeply unpopular, and that Trump is also frustrating the business community, which is really important. We know from the rise of the Nazis that which way the business community jumps is really important. And he's
Mm,
been taking cuts of all these different companies. There was yet another one today, which is essentially a form of state capitalism as opposed to the free markets that business tends to like. But you can also tell that protesters are really getting under at least Stephen Miller's skin from the fact he melted down the other day with the
yes.
comments about the aging hippies. It's important that it's older white people out there because it's very hard to call out troops to attack old white people. And that's actually something I'm really proud of protesters for
Mm,
doing, is getting out there and saying, we think in America of protest as being a young person's game. But there's no reason to think that. Older people have been involved in protests for a long time. And this time around, it seems like they're in the forefront. And that really, really matters because Stephen Miller can't portray, somebody in their wheelchair as the kind of racist uh, takes he takes on people of color.
no, you're absolutely right. And I took my little dog Duke up to a protest here in DC last night. And you're absolutely right. There were some senior citizens out there, and I was so proud of them. And they had some of the feistiest signs too. I mean, there were a couple of really good ones. One of them was about how, the presence of the National Guard was definitely a distraction from the Epstein files. And, I love that you see Epstein files, release the Epstein file signs all over DC now. And a lot of the protests, you're right, are baby boomers who are getting out there and doing it. And for the folks who are out there, because I see this from time to time, Heather, and I think you do as well. People want to know, what can they do? How can they get involved? Get out there and protest. The protest I saw was perfectly peaceful last night. The DC police cordoned off a couple of block radius around what was taking place. There were little kids dancing in the street, no trouble whatsoever. And we just need more of that, kind of like a happy people power energy.
We definitely need more of that. I would
Yeah.
also urge people to really put pressure on Congress for over
Mm,
voting rights, because I really think this is what's going on, is an attempt to rig our voting system. And with Congress coming back into session on September 2nd, clearly the fight over redistricting is going to be on the table. And I mean,
mm,
making sure your Republican representatives, both at the national level but also at the state level, in those states you mentioned, Texas, Indiana, Florida, Ohio, the places where Trump is putting pressure, hear that this is something that is deeply unpopular, because it is. Even
yeah.
Republicans don't like gerrymandering. We would like to have this straightened out around the country. And I do
Yeah.
think there is one thing about the baby boomers, and that's that if you are under probably 55, you don't remember a time when American democracy worked. If you are over 55, you feel like what was our birthright has been taken over by this very small group of radical extremists that is trying to destroy democracy. And
Yeah.
so I think one of the reasons so many of us are out there is because we can sit there and say, hey, we remember the way it used to work when
Yeah.
Congress would compromise and you would get deals that actually worked for the American people. And that's something that if you're, as I say, if you're younger than 50 anyway, you don't remember when politics wasn't the Republicans simply playing it as an all or nothing game in which they were the ones who got to call all the shots.
That's such a great point. And the other thing that you are thinking back to your expertise on Reconstruction, I have to ask this question, and forgive me if it's a question that can't, be totally answered with any, 100% certainty. But the way that the Republicans are trying to redraw these congressional maps, particularly in Texas, but I would have to assume in Ohio and Indiana, wherever else they do it, is going to take congressional seats away from people of color. And I wonder if we have seen it to this degree since Reconstruction.
Well, I mean, this is what the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was
Y-
designed to combat, of
Yeah,
course. So since 1965, no. And John Roberts, who is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, has made it his life's work to get rid of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So really, since then, we have not seen it. But one of the things that I think is important when you think about Reconstruction and again in the present is the degree to which the radical extremists have made poverty and people of color and women the same thing. It's two sets
mm,
of language to say those people should not vote. So when in Texas, for example, they can say this is not about race, this is only about partisan gerrymandering, which the Supreme Court has blessed. That doesn't preclude the fact that the Texas gerrymander makes a white vote significantly more powerful than a black or brown vote, or than a,
yeah,
so that that unity of the way we talk about race and class in the United States matters, and it actually comes out of Reconstruction when after the 15th Amendment in 1870 and the establishment of the Department of Justice in 1870, it became a federal crime to discriminate against Black men at the voting places on the grounds of race, right?
right.
But as soon as that happens in 1871, former Confederates, especially in South Carolina, begin to say, hey, we don't have any problem with anybody's race. Our problem is that these people are poor and they're trying
Mm,
to elect people who will put down roads and build schools and build hospitals, and that can only be paid for with tax dollars paid for by property owners. And since only white people own property in the post-Civil War South, this is a redistribution of wealth from white people to black people, and it is a
mm,
form, they said, of socialism. And it's important to think about that word socialism in the United States as a political term, not as an economic term. It means
right.
we don't want poor people, especially poor people of color, to vote. Similarly, when they start talking about capitalism as opposed to capital or capitalists, they start doing that after this period in which they start talking about socialism as poor people voting. And they talk about how America should be about capitalism. And now, of course, we understand that as an economic term, but what they were saying at the time was that the people who should be running the government are people with money. And
Wow.
that's a really important and of course they were all white men. So there's this weird overlap that also is kind of a loophole that lets somebody like the people under Nixon talk about busing rather than talking about race, you know?
Right. It's coded. It's coded
It's all
language.
coded. That's the word, coded.
And I mean, I spoke with Congressman Greg Casar of Texas. He represents Austin or an Austin-based district. And, he will lose his seat, Latino member of Congress. He's going to lose his seat as a result of this. And there are other uh, members of Congress of color who are going to go through the same thing. And I don't see how John Roberts can live with himself. I don't see how he can live with himself if you take away the Voting Rights Act, if you strike down these very critical civil rights laws of the 1960s. I mean, of course, this is what everybody predicted was going to happen, and now it's starting to happen. They will say it's political redistricting, but they're taking power away from people of color.
But Jim, this is the plan.
Yeah.
So, think about what Peter Thiel wrote years ago about how democracy and capitalism couldn't coexist after the
Mm,
1920s, when women and people of color got the vote. There's two ways to think about the way government should work in the United States of America. And one is that we are all created equal and we have a right to have a say in our government, to be treated equally before the law and have equal access to resources like healthcare and education and the raw materials we need to have jobs and things like that. And then there's another way to think about it. And that's when you think that there are some people who are better than others and have the right to rule. And if you believe that, then you believe that the kind of democracy I just described, the democracy that is laid out in the Declaration of Independence, is ruining that system. It's
mm,
poisoning that system, and you need to get rid of it in order to make sure those, wealthy, educated, just better people would be able to rule. And this is
mm,
where we are now in this moment with Donald Trump. Remember, he's going to have the best people running his administration. And if you listen carefully, you will notice that there is a very strong overlap between that argument I just made and, of course, the enslavers of the pre Civil War years, but also with fascism. Because if some
yeah.
people are better than others, by definition, person's going to be better than all the rest. And he's the one who should dictate to the rest of us. And now we've
Yeah.
come full circle to what's happening in Washington, D.C.
No, you're right, and I don't see how anybody could argue that Stephen Miller is the best of us. I mean, is anybody really going to make that argument with a straight face? Any Republican or Democrat going to make that argument with a straight face in this country? And I think you're absolutely right. And it makes me, it makes me want to say that what we're experiencing right now is fascism. Right in my neighborhood, there's a free book box, and on the door of the free book box is a note that says what to do if you're stopped by ICE. It has nothing to do with the free books in the book box, but it's a little note that they hope that the person just casually walks by will read. And are we at that point now, Heather, where we're having to send little coded messages of survival to one another? I don't want my home. This is my hometown. I don't want Washington, D.C. to become a police state. But I don't know how just me, myself, this one individual person right here can stop that from happening. And I'm deadly serious about this. And I'm very passionate about this. It pisses me off to no end that this is happening to my hometown.
Yes, I'm an annoying stickler in that there are hallmarks of the economic system of fascism that I actually don't think we're seeing in the United States right now.
Mm,
Not that that matters. It's a sticking point for me. I would say authoritarianism, because
mm,
in that case, instead of having this at least idea of a corporate oligarchy, you have personal rule. And
mm,
that doesn't matter to you and me at all. The effect is the same. It's still a police state. But that's why I've been reluctant to use the word fascism. Are we there?
yeah.
100%. We are absolutely there. We're in what uh, political scientists like Steve Levitsky call competitive authoritarianism, where elections will be held because the authoritarian wants the legitimacy of an election, the way Vladimir Putin holds elections or the way Viktor Orban in Hungary holds elections. But they are not competitive because
Yeah.
of the administration's control of the media and having police at the polls and so on, and fear of arrest. Now, all that being said, the game's not over yet. You and I are
Yeah.
sitting here talking. These are enormously unpopular positions. The American people hate them. We are not used to being told what to do by our governments. And
Yes.
at the same time, if you think about the rise of somebody like Hitler or even Orban, they rose. I shouldn't have put Orban there because his real issue was about immigration, but they rose at times when the economy was really terrible. Now, if you
Mm.
think about Trump in this administration, the economy was booming. He's the one who has destroyed it. And you
That's
hear him
right.
trying to say, no, no, the economy's really good. Well, I don't know about you. I went and bought coffee the other day at the supermarket and you just about had a coronary. I don't know how
It's
you miss that the prices are going up and the tariffs haven't really hit yet, because they
yeah.
really only went into effect in August. So even the people who have supported Trump in the past are wavering on him or against him. His numbers are very low. And we still have Epstein out there, which is what brought the QAnon
Yes.
people to him. And the QAnon voters, I think, made up about 21% of his base. I could be wrong. Somebody should check me on
Pretty
that.
darn close to that. That's exactly right.
But the way we push back is we stop believing everything he says. We stop assuming he has power he does not. We push back in every possible way. We celebrate the victories that we have had, like the closing of the detention facility in the Everglades and the release
Mhm.
today of Kilmar Abrego Garcia. We keep reiterating that in the United States of America, our democracy says that we, the people, are running this government. It is our power. And we put
Yeah.
pressure on our electeds, again, from the town level to the state level to the federal level, to say, we are not going to put up with this and recognize that it's going to take some time and you've got to build communities. And if you need to look away, you can look away. But if we continue to hold tight to our principles and if we continue to express those through art and literature and community and pushing back on on the government's overreach,
Yeah.
will we come out of it? Yes. And with luck, we will come out of it better than we went in. Because, like I say, it hasn't been working real well for the last 40 years.
No, that's you're absolutely right about that, and I think that, Trump, likes to rattle our cages. There's no question about it, but he also is a motivating force, and I get the sense that people are feeling dejected, they're feeling defeated, they have what I used to call Trump depression, for as much as people worry about, Trump derangement syndrome, I say Trump depression syndrome is a, much more worrisome thing, and I think people have succumbed to it. I think people are coming out of it, and I do think that the wild card in all of this is Jeffrey Epstein. And they can put out this, Ghislaine Maxwell transcript on a Friday afternoon and try to sell it on Fox News and the MAGA. But they just need to know. They just need to know over at the DOJ and down at the White House that their own people are not buying it. When Ghislaine Maxwell tells Todd Blanche, whatever, oh, it's extraordinary that he's become the president. And he always treated me in such a nice manner. Nobody believes that.
No, that's right. And again, we had that happen to us with Bill Barr and the pre-reading of the Mueller
The
report. So
Mueller
we've been
report.
here before.
We've
I
been
would
here
say
before.
that that is a wild card, but I do think Trump's mental health is another big wild card.
Yes.
Because even if you're MAGA, like you say, even if you're a loyalist in the administration, the fact that he has command of the U.S. military and the nuclear football. And he's making noises about attacking Mexico and Venezuela.
Yeah.
And the concept, and he's talked about that before, but that's cause for war. And that's not, I mean, it's a war of choice in a really weird way. You've
Yeah.
got to be sitting there thinking, it's time to think of other options, to see if we can ease him out, get him to retire, get him to rebuild another building or something,
Yeah.
because he is, regardless of whether you like him or not, he remains the most powerful man in the world, and he is bonkers. And
Yeah.
that is something that gets me really concerned because we're all pretending he's okay, and he's not. All you have to do
No.
is watch one of these interviews,
It's
and
so
you
true.
think,
Well,
who wears a hat that says I'm right about everything?
the hat was batshit crazy, and the way he talks about fixing the grasses in Washington D.C., to me, I challenge anybody on any bar stool in Lincoln, Nebraska, to put that up on full blast on your 50-inch LCD TV and absorb him saying that and ask yourself, isn't he crazy? How can he not be cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs, as you said earlier? The other thing, too, that I think is a tell, and you have to sometimes be very, this is my observation having covered Trump up close for some time. There are tells, not just from him, but from his people. But when Pam Bondi was on Fox last night, and she was also talking about fixing the grass in DC, which means that there's a fair amount of just sort of placating, trying not to disturb the wild bird. There I that it's so funny that you mentioned that earlier about giving him projects like fixing up a ballroom or putting up gold leafing in the Oval Office and so on. Because I think that does indicate that what's going on behind closed doors is just the madness of King George.
Well, and the what's interesting about it is the parallels to an abusive family, because
Yeah.
doesn't he feel like the crazy, um,
Yes.
the guy who would just will fly off and start causing trouble and hurting people, and so everyone's kind of tiptoeing around him and trying to give him make work and say nice things. Look, here's a nice hat that says you were right about everything. Let's talk about grass. And again, it is a very sad situation.
Yeah.
For the entire world, but it does suggest that the only way out is to take back our power and say, no, we're not going to put up with this. And
Yeah.
we don't care if Stephen Miller is getting all weepy about the 90-year-old hippies, but we're going to be
He really
insisting
doesn't like
on.
those hippies.
No, he does not. He does not. And here's a newsflash: we're not all 90. Um, but
Good point.
but
Some of us wear black polos, by the way, but anyway.
that's right, exactly. But so, it's just a weird time for America. I will tell you
Yeah.
that one of the things that is interesting for me is I write about it every day. I read all day and I write all day. And sometimes when I write, the story turns out to be different than I thought it was. So, like this
Mm.
whole thing that I'm talking about now, about the firing of the intelligence agents and the firing today of the head of the Pentagon Intelligence Division or whatever it's called. I'm sorry, I don't have the name in front of me. And,
Yep.
all that stuff. I did not think that was today's big story. But then when I put it in there and thought, why are we talking about Donald Trump and Putin in this photograph from Putin? And why are we firing all these people? And why is he going after, as he did in July, James Comey and John
Mhm.
Brennan, who were the heads of the FBI and the CIA during the Russia investigation? And I thought, I don't know if that's a story or not, but I do know that there's an awful lot of material on it that feels like shouldn't be there if the real story is a simple straight shot to authoritarianism.
Yeah. And Heather, I think what should give us a little bit of hope is that when they're firing 40% of the workforce at the Defense Intelligence Agency or the Director of National Intelligence or wherever, it tells you that there's still good people working in our government. And I talk about this with my friend Olivia Troy and Miles Taylor from time to time. They're absolutely convinced that there are still some good people in the bowels of the government in important places who are hearing these conversations, picking up on this stuff. I mean, we hear stories all the time privately about when people go into meetings with Kash Patel and various officials of the government, they got to turn in their phones. They're being asked to sign NDAs. This banana stuff is still going on in Trump 2.0. And if they're trying to eliminate these good people at these various agencies, it tells you that there are still good people there who can be witness to this. And for when there is an accountability moment in this country, those people can step forward. And I try to have some hope that that may still happen.
Yeah, and the other piece of that, I think that's important. The other piece of that is once they're out, they're on the outside.
Hmm.
And those of us who are on the outside, one of the things that I look at is, again, this is a really big country, which I think matters when you think about the rise of authoritarianism, because it's really hard to stamp down on 341 million people as
Yeah.
opposed to Germany before World War II. There's a lot of us. And if you think about the quality of the people who are standing against the Trump administration versus those who are on the inside, you know, I think that the system, the way the Republicans set it up for 40 years, enabled the takeover by this radical group of extremists, this very small group of radical extremists. But then I think about the people outside and I think, really? Really, are you going to take a look at the extraordinary talent outside the government and say that it is ultimately going to be beaten by Stephen Miller?
Right.
And that's a hard, it just doesn't seem to work.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And I finally, Heather, and we can keep going. Whatever you want to talk about, we can talk about. But the last time we spoke, you coined a term that I fell in love with, and I've been thinking about ever since, and that is a news community. And I sort of think that's what we're part of here, on social media and independent media, and it's something that just needs to be fostered and encouraged. It was kind of depressing to me to watch the coverage around the Anchorage summit because it was treated as if it was normal. It was normalized and sanitized as if what we were watching was something that was normal when it wasn't. And then after it was over, it was everybody realized, oh, this was a joke. But there were plenty of us going into this who thought this is a joke. But I think having independent media and the rise of it is such a healthy thing for this democracy. And I know people are worried that this is all going down the tubes and stuff, but I do see this one thing as being a point of light.
Oh, I agree,
Yeah,
and it's been long overdue, but remember,
yeah,
we didn't have that independent news community in the first term at all. If
yeah.
you think about
That's right.
Substack, I started on Substack. I started on Facebook first in September of 2019, and when I went onto
Wow.
Substack, I was one of the first people on it. They came to me because they were starting up. Now
Mm,
look at it, and look at
it's
the
incredible.
literally millions of people that get their news, from really good news purveyors that are writing in different places. And one of the things that jumps out to me about that is so many times people say to me, "Well, I really don't understand this stuff. I really don't care about politics." And I think, you're reading Joyce White Vance. You're reading Chris Geidner. Those are not easy reads. And you're reading Paul Krugman every day.
Oh,
Those
great.
are
Yeah,
not easy reads, but it
yeah,
feels easier in part because there isn't crap there all around them that you don't care about. And if you read me, and millions of people do, and they say, "Oh, well, you just make it easy. I really don't understand this stuff." And I have to laugh because if you read me, you are reading the equivalent of five 350-page books a year on history
wow.
and politics. Now, how much of an expert reads five 350-page books on any subject at all every year? So in a way, feel like we have not only created a news community, but we have fed this incredible hunger for real news
Mm,
that's out there. And we've created a community that cares about reality again, which was always the plan, right? Create a reality-based community, and then people will vote intelligently, not necessarily the same way you will. That's not the point.
yeah,
But if they vote with a regard for what facts are and what truth is, they will vote in ways that are correct for them. And that, at the end of the day, is the goal of democracy. So it's an exciting time for all that's also a frightening time.
yeah. There's no question about it. And if folks don't look too far down their nose at us video folks, video purveyors here on Substack, I would be very appreciative of that. But because I do think there is just such a benefit in having these kinds of conversations. I think they're just so valuable in that there's a community aspect to it. And I know maybe you occasionally look down at the messages. I look down at the messages, and it's just it warms my heart to know that people are so engaged and they care so much. And that tells me that we're not going down the tubes just yet. Stephen Miller can call us hippies and get red in the face, and whatever's happening with his hair can do what it's doing. But I started off this hour not having a whole lot of hope, and now I'm ending it with some hope. So thank you.
Well,
It feels
and
good.
think about it. Now that we're not filtered by our professions or our bosses or whomever, we have developed all these relationships and friendships. So
Yeah,
that, I think, shows, and I think it shows that we are part of a national community. I wish it will not be me, but I wish somebody would be watching the growth of this, because
yeah,
there is going to be a great book to be written about how Americans recreated a national community and how they came to define America in a new way. We're not quite there yet, but we will be. And I
yeah,
think about my period, the late 19th century, when they did this to create the progressive era. And I
yes.
realize we're in it. And I wish I had the time and the perspective to be taking notes on it, to watch how it's going to develop, because it's going to be one hell of a story.
Yeah. No, there's no question about it. I mean, the muckrakers that we used to study of that era, and shortly after that era began, I mean, we're kind of in that new age of whatever this is of media, and it's just starting and it's just getting going, and it feels great to be a part of. And Always wonderful to have these conversations and connect with you, and I just hope we can keep doing it. We ping each other, and I reached out to you and said, "Can we do this?" And then you were asking me about the sturgeon, and I was like, "Well, I'm more of a Chesapeake Bay guy. I like blue crab and rockfish, and we got to get to maybe put me in the mood for seafood. Honestly, what we need to do is get together and have some seafood."
Well, the story behind that for people listening is that where I kayak, we are seeing sturgeon for the first time in a very long time. And if you've never seen a sturgeon, I urge you to go on YouTube and watch it, what it looks like when a sturgeon jumps, because that sucker's not messing around. And I was so excited. I told Jim, I'm like, we could talk about sturgeons because I was out yesterday and there was a 4-footer that jumped right near my kayak. And it's
Wow.
really cool. It's really cool, but it's really spooky. I mean, it
Well,
was almost as long as my kayak.
the freaky fish that they have around here in the Potomac, they have these snakehead fish that they're freaks of nature in that they look like snakes and that they can briefly go on land and then go back in the water and survive. For folks who want to look that up, it's a weird thing. They're an invasive species and they've been telling people please catch them and eat them. We don't care whatever size they are, just please pull them out of the Potomac River. And so don't recommend eating stuff out of the Potomac River, but they have said if you catch these snakehead fish, please dispose of them
Oh, well,
because they've been wreaking havoc here. But
I'll have to look them up. But there we
yeah,
go. Now we went full circle back to the fact that people aren't being able to keep out exotic species. So
I know
let's
it's so true. And we've got these little bugs too, these little red-bellied beetles that are wreaking havoc here in DC, and they've been telling people to stomp on them. And I'm kind of, I feel, well, I mean, I will kill a horsefly. I will do that because I can't have them in the house. But I do feel bad stepping on a beetle out in public. But there's telling people to kill those little buggers. So anyway.
well, that's what we can start our new movement on, getting rid of the invasive species. But a sturgeon is not invasive, and they're really impressive.
That's true. That's true. But if you look at these little beetles that I'm talking about here, they almost look like they have a little red MAGA hat on. But anyway, I won't expand that analogy too further. But Heather, great to see you.
It's always a pleasure. Let's do it again soon, Jim.
Thanks for putting up with my corny dad jokes. All right, great to see you.
Talk to you later.
Take care.